So, Philip Pettit, what went wrong? Why was it that societies were so unable to deal with a pandemic, given that there were recent examples of similar sorts of crises with SARS and swine flu? Why did societies fail to deal with the pandemic?
Well, it's a very big question, Matthew, but there are a few thoughts that strike me. I'm not sure that they have any depth to them, but there's some obvious things to say, I think. One is that, and let's focus on democracies in general, since you raised a question about them. I think similar thoughts actually apply even to, say, a country like China. But in a democracy, there's a big divide between, so to speak, those who are elected to government. I call them to domain general positions, making laws and executing the laws, administering the laws. And then those who are appointed to domain specific areas, like judges, for example, like election commissioners, like those on a central bank. And it's really important, like, auditors general, inspectors general, all of these positions, these domain-specific positions, are as important to the working of democracy as the election of domain general authorities. They're appointed, it's true, by those who are elected, but they're appointed ideally under, transparency conditions, under severe constraints and so on. And in their specific areas, it's pretty clear what people want of them. For example, central bank, low, keep unemployment low, keep inflation low. And similarly in the other areas, election commission, you want fairness, and well, it's very difficult to work out the actual criteria, but we know, roughly speaking, what they should be. And so it's easy, as it were, to lay down in these specific areas what the people expect of those in government. Now, the problem is there's always a tension between those elected to domain general authorities, the legislature and the central executive, and those appointed to domain specific authorities or positions or bodies. And the tension is this, that those in charge are, of course, those elected, and those elected have a relatively short-term horizon. I mean, they're not going to be there forever, unless they're very identified with the party and put the party interests before their own interests, which can happen, and I think can be actually quite a good thing. It gives a longer time horizon. But there is always that difficulty. It's win the next election is the main thing. And so you add to that now the idea, which has become popular, that people just want lower taxes and that that's the best possible vote winner. And you can see the temptation and the pressure on those in the domain general elected positions to try to cut the funding to those in the domain specific, the domain special, so to speak, positions. And I think this applies particularly in an area like public health. And because where public health, most of the concerns are very long-term. For example, the rise of an epidemic or a pandemic, as we've seen, or the decline in infrastructure, the quality of water or air over the longer term. And so the short-term people in elected office will often find it easy to try to cut back on the money going to those other areas. I think that's one reason. I mean, I thought that, normally you'd expect crisis to reinforce government in its commitment in these domain-specific areas. But it was so disappointing after the great financial crisis that really that didn't happen. We're still back in a position where we could have another great financial crisis. There's no doubt about that. It might be slightly better than it was in 2007-8, but we didn't respond there. My hope is that with the pandemic, where it's clear that there always was a threat like this, that we should have been planning against, and we should have resources to deal with, and we should have plan of actions and so on in place, all, of course, under the aegis of a domain-specific authority, like, for example, central, disease control centers, that sort of thing. That really, I think, just simply got put on the sideline. And that is, it's, so to speak, explicable, given the structure of politics, with those elected being in charge and those in the more specific positions, appointed positions, being equally important and equally responsive to public interest, because people know what they want from a public health body, being actually sidelined and made less important. So I think that that's probably that's the main thing, the short-termism. I think that that is the source of our problem here. Of course, as I say, it also arises even in a country like China, I think, where, you know, it's really important for the party to maintain its legitimacy. It's important that it should keep the economy, you know, pumping, you know, and that again is going to take the emphasis elsewhere from the longer term issues like health, for example, public health. I don't know whether that's, you know, that's probably pretty obvious stuff, really, but I think it's worth saying. And what's particularly worth saying is that democracy does not run just by elections. Democracy works by virtue of having a system where you have domain general positions, you know, which have to be elected to. I would say that's probably the best means, although you need a lot of control over elections to make sure they're fair and so on, and people will vote. But it also runs on this range of depoliticized, so to speak, government in these domain-specific bodies, authorities, and so on. And the third wing, of course, is that you get constant public awareness of what's happening, a contestation of both the domain general and the domain specific authorities as to what they're doing. But those three dimensions, you know, the elected, the appointed but unelected domain specific authorities, and public sort of interest bodies that keep them, as it were, keep them honest, you know, keep an eye on them. I think these are the three sort of pillars, really, of democracy. And I think, unfortunately, that the elected tends to have most of the money going to it. It tends to be the action, the decisions are made, and that's going to create a sort of short-termism.
That's really interesting. And I suppose I'd just like to pick up on that third pillar that you talked about there, public opinion. And it was clear at the beginning of the pandemic that the public was fearful of the rise in cases and the transmission, community transmission that was being seen in societies far removed from China. Much of political thought has been fairly dismissive of fear as an emotion. How can we distinguish between public fears about something like a pandemic or about different crises and the sorts of fears that are associated with phobias like homophobia?
Well, I think the range of fears, so to speak, that ought not to really ought not to trigger action by government. So one is excess timidity. You know, people can be excessively timid, as we know. And now, while I think the law and the state should provide, you know, social security, legal security, and a whole range of securities as part of a decent working polity, you can't do anything about someone who's so timid, so to speak, that they're afraid to talk up to the boss, even though they have rights against the boss, for example. So that sort of fear. Second sort is irrelevant, I think, to politics. It's a matter of ethics. You know, it should be up to a person to overcome their timidity. Racism and the various forms of pathology of that kind, they, of course, also source fears like homophobia, you've mentioned, you know, the sort of fear of Jews that was so powerful in Germany in the 30s and so was stoked up, of course, or the fear of, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement in the States on the part of various white conservative groups. These fears are equally, I think, not really, I mean, they shouldn't be responded to by government in the sense of government doing things in order to allay those fears, because those fears are sourced in a sort of prejudice. Now, what government could do, of course, is to seek to undercut that prejudice and to educate and so on, and to reconcile different groups. But that sort of fear is equally a fear that you might put it should be should be put aside. But there are other fears in the populace which are really important, and I think are a reason for government to act, and those are the fears which people have reason to have, rational fears, if you like. Now, as you know, I'm associated with people often think of as Republican thinking in politics, and one of the main strands of Republican thought down over 2,000 years is that if you are in a position of lack of power, which means that you have good reason to fear somebody turning against you because they've got a power of interference in your life. It might be the power of a boss who can fire you at will. It might be the power of a husband in a society where you don't have anything like equality across genders, that your husband will, for example, abuse you domestically or will assert rights he has that you don't have, as might be the case in various societies. These are totally reasoned fears. They're fears, notice, of the human will of those who are in power over you. And of course, that's a fear that should be central to government action, in the sense that part of what the law should be about is precisely enabling people to enjoy a life where they, in certain areas, do not live in fear of those who have power over them, so that power is checked by the law, is checked by the norms in the society, encouraged by the law, is checked by the power that is given to the weaker, as in the power of divorce in marriage enables no fault as divorce enables a woman, to actually leave a marriage. That's a power, the power of a trade union, to call a strike. This is a power that's really important to combat that rational fear you might have of those in power over you. That's one sort of fear. Now, the other sort of fear that's rational is indeed the fear of something like a natural catastrophe. So, for example, the fear of public health type fears about, the water not being clean, about the land being, fracking and the result that it might have, for example, in the stability of the land you live on. All of these fears are totally rational. And it's part of government's job, if it's going to be responsive to people, as in a democratic regime, that it should try to, so to speak, put things right to the extent that at least the reason for those sorts of fears are reduced. And the case of, the fear of a pandemic, we now know what that is. People probably weren't that aware. We've forgotten the Spanish flu of 1919 or 1918-19. We'd forgotten it. Hopefully this pandemic will restore that, so to speak, sense on the government's part that we have to reduce people's reason for fear on this front. And that means invest in the public health authorities and the public health procedures and so on that will provide us with both the information, the knowledge, the understanding, and also the resources and the plans to combat the possible rise of another pandemic in future years, or indeed the continuation of this pandemic at some level of severity. Hopefully, again, to go back to the first theme, it will encourage government to move towards the empowerment and the funding of these powerful domain-specific areas of government that are so important to a democracy, but in particular, public health in this instance.
That's really interesting, because you're talking there about a process of almost reversing 40 years of, or 4 decades of neoliberal reform, in which social safety nets have been rolled back, in which the place of government in people's lives has been stripped back, and in which people have been told that security really comes from participation in the economy. And I think throughout the pandemic, it became increasingly clear that really government intervention really was necessary in order to secure people's lives. What elements of neoliberal governance do you think will survive the pandemic?
Well, yeah, I'm certainly not a neoliberal, as you know. In fact, I think myself, this is probably a very narrow view, but I think of the main philosophies of government, at least in the democratic world, as being neoliberalism for sure, neopopulism, and I call that neo because it's not the populism of the 19th century, which is not constitutional populism of the older sort. And then there's what I think of as neo-republicanism. Now, the signature theme, as you well know, of neo-republican thought as against neoliberal is that what freedom requires isn't sort of hands-off, laissez-faire, free for all, as you might call it, where and the devil take the hindmost. It's rather freedom in the sense, and that sense of freedom, that neoliberal and indeed classical liberal sense of freedom, essentially takes law to be hostile to freedom. So every act of law, it may protect people, may do better, more good than harm, but in itself, it takes away people's freedom. So freedom is thought of as natural freedom that law invades. Now, if you think in those terms, it's very easy move to think that, well, what we should do is reduce the state as far as possible, because, to the bare minimum necessary to avoid total civil wars, social unrest, and so on, but to reduce law and to empower and extend markets, because on the face of it, it looks like markets work by contract only. You agree to sign up to certain conditions and so on, and then, so to speak, it's a competitive world where the more successful, of course, get very wealthy, the less successful get very poor. But the idea is, in the neoliberal vision, is that this sort of competition, it makes people rugged and willing to work and so on. I mean, you can see the attraction of it. It's a rugged individualism. But that it does push for minimize the state, maximize the markets, and that's really what's been happening, because that notion of freedom really has became dominant, I think mainly in recent years as a result of the work of people like Milton Friedman, who was extraordinarily influential, way beyond his merits, I would say. Now, I think that neoliberalism really has been deeply challenged because, of course, it's become clear that the state is essential in dealing with this sort of issue, as it became clear that the state and states were essential in dealing with the global financial crisis back in 2008, as it's obviously clear that states are essential in dealing with climate change and the great problems there. States in unison with one another must act on a global front. And it's clear that the markets will not do much in themselves, short of being, regulated, moderated by state action, which determines exactly what markets can do and what companies can do within markets. Okay, while that argues against neoliberalism for more part of the state, we need that power. And the trouble with neopopulism is that it says this power should be in the hands of just those who are elected, because only they speak for the people. Only they're responsive to a terrible phrase introduced by that wonderful man, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the will of the people, or the general will, as he called it. I mean, that's it's captured people's minds. And so neopopulism is an entry there in saying that, look, democracy is about just giving people power, and that means giving their representatives power, because you can't have plenary democracy. But that too is a real problem, because of course those in power, look at Bolsonaro, look at the general performance of the autocratic Democrats, so to speak, of the democratic autocrats, I should say, those who were elected. And in neopopulism, what they've always wanted to get rid of, remember I said democracy's 3 pillars, those elected to the main general office, those appointed to the main specific office, and a contested republic. It's very interesting that neopopulists like Putin, like Erdogan, like Hungary and these other countries, they all want to get rid of both the domain-specific appointed authorities or reduce their power, and they want to get rid of contestation from within. they say about the first, the domain specific authorities, they're not elected. They don't speak for the people. They're the deep state, in that horrible phrase that, Trumpists have sort of put in circulation. And they criticize, of course, the contestatory element on the grounds usually they're foreign agents, they're coming in from outside. Okay, what you really need is a vision of government where there are three pillars. So government has to become important, has to become empowered, and we should recognize it as a necessity. But that power has to be invested in the domain-specific authorities that will look after issues like public health and so on, and the issues that are going to arise more and more with climate change, and of course the issues that are going to arise with financial instability of the kind that seems to become more or less chronic with us. I said the core idea in neoliberalism was that freedom meant there was no law. The core idea in neo-republicanism is that freedom means security under the law against the discretionary interference of others, or even of those in government. So you need the protections of the law against others, against companies and so on, and people need to be protected. They also need to be empowered by social security measures, so that they're not, so to speak, having to live at the mercy of others. But equally, people have to be empowered against government itself, democratic controls and so on. And freedom in this image consists in not being bossed around, not being stood over, not being dominated, where that the Romans used dominatio as the relationship between a master, even a really kindly master, and a slave, not to be dominated in that way by the powerful. Freedom in this sense is the creation, the artifact of law, not the antonym of law as it is in their liberal view. That's the sort of view we need of freedom as against the neoliberal view, but we also need, as against the neo-populist view, a richer understanding of democracy as having these three pillars, and an understanding of democracy that those in power are only going to be constrained so that they don't have, as it were, arbitrary or discretionary power over us, if there are non-elected bodies that are empowered in various ways under the Constitution and so on, that can look to matters of public health and look to matters like the economy and so on. That's a long spiel. I'm sorry, you pressed a button, Matthew, but I hope it is intelligible.
That was really interesting. Philip Pettit, thanks very much.
A pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you.